You stole my life. Those were the first words my daughter screamed at me before she threw a plate of food in my face. The gravy burned my chest. The chicken slid down my blouse. And the sting of humiliation cut deeper than the heat of the meal. My sister, who had come by for Sunday dinner, froze with her fork mid-air, her eyes darting from me to Rebecca, as if she had walked into a storm she didn't want to be part of. My grandson dropped his spoon, the clatter echoing in the silence, and whispered, "Mum, please don't." But Rebecca was already standing, fists trembling, her whole body radiating fury, her face red and wet with tears that didn't soften her voice. "You never wanted me to live. You chained me with your sacrifices, your rules, your guilt. You killed my joy, and now you want me to thank you for it." I just sat there, stunned, food dripping onto the carpet, unable to move or even defend myself. For a moment, I thought she was possessed, because that couldn't be my child. The little girl who used to braid my hair while I napped after double shifts. The one who cried when I left for work and clung to me when I came home with sore feet. This woman, screaming as if I had stolen her soul, felt like a stranger. She shoved her chair back so hard it scraped the floor, stormed toward the door, and slammed it with such force that the glass in the windows rattled. My grandson followed, sobbing, but she pushed him aside as if his small body were just another obstacle in her way. Then she was gone, leaving only the smell of grease, the sound of silence, and the ugly mess of food across the room like evidence of a crime. My sister looked at me, speechless. I turned toward the sink, ran cold water, and tried to wash the stains off my blouse. But my hands shook so badly that I dropped the cloth twice. Each time I bent down to pick it up, my knees cracked, my back ached, and I felt older than my 58 years. The tears I fought against spilled anyway, mixing with the water until the kitchen blurred before me. "You stole my life." The words circled in my head like vultures. How could she believe that? Did she think the long nights I walked home in the dark after cleaning hospital wards were about stealing? Did she think I worked 2 shifts at a time to keep the lights on just to chain her? When she wanted sneakers like the other kids, I skipped my own lunches to save for them. When she got sick in the middle of winter, I pawned my wedding ring for her medicine. I thought I was building her a future, shielding her from the racism and poverty that chewed me up when I was her age. But she looked me in the face, after everything, and declared me her thief. I wanted to shout back that I had given her everything I had, every ounce of strength, every dollar, every prayer. I wanted to tell her that when she slept, I lay awake, counting bills, and wondering if I would survive long enough to see her graduate, to see her safe. I wanted to ask her if she understood what it means to be a black woman fighting through hospital shifts where patients refused my touch because of my skin, where supervisors gave me the worst rotations because they assumed I wouldn't complain, where every step forward came with another reminder that I was never meant to be equal. I didn't endure all that to rob my daughter. I endured it so she could walk easier than I did. But none of that came out of my mouth. My throat closed, and silence swallowed me whole. That night, after my sister left and my grandson cried himself to sleep, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan. The house, the only house I ever owned, the one I bought with sweat and second-hand furniture, creaked around me like it, too, was holding its breath. I kept seeing Rebecca's face twisted in rage, kept hearing her words like a curse. "You stole my life." I thought about all the women I knew, neighbours, church sisters, who had warned me not to give too much, not to let a child drain me dry. But how could I not? She was mine. She was my only one. Sleep never came. Instead, I replayed decades of sacrifice, wondering when exactly love turned into chains in her eyes. Was it when I told her no to a party because I was afraid of drunk drivers? Was it when I begged her to finish college so she wouldn't depend on a man? Was it when I worked instead of attending her school plays, thinking I was buying her stability while she counted my absence as betrayal? The ache in my chest spread until it felt like my whole body was bruised. I thought the worst had happened that night. The plate, the scream, the shame. But I didn't know yet that within a week my phone would ring, and I would hear that same voice begging me through tears for bail money, her words no longer sharp with rage, but heavy with desperation. I didn't know that humiliation was only the beginning, and that soon I would have to choose between saving my daughter again and saving myself for the first time in my life. The morning after that terrible dinner, I woke with the heaviness of a storm still pressing on my chest. The words my daughter had screamed kept rolling through my mind like a cruel chorus I could not silence, and the stains of food on the carpet were still visible reminders of the chaos that had erupted in the very room where I had hoped to nurture peace. I tried to carry on with routine, because routine is what women like me have always clung to. I boiled water for tea, folded laundry, swept the kitchen floor, but everything felt brittle, as if the smallest touch might shatter the day. I told myself she would cool down, that she might even call with an apology. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my grandson moving around the house quietly, afraid to make noise. His eyes avoided mine, though I caught the sadness in them every time he looked in my direction, as if he were carrying a burden far too heavy for a child. By the third day, worry began to replace anger. Rebecca hadn't come home, hadn't checked in, hadn't even called her son. My sister came by with a casserole and whispered, "You know she's been slipping, right?" I shook my head because I didn't want to hear it, but she insisted, telling me about people in town who had seen Rebecca drinking late into the night, about whispers of fights in bars, about her showing up at places she didn't belong with men who were only interested in trouble. I wanted to deny it, to believe my daughter was just going through a rough season, but my stomach churned with dread. Then, a week after the plate had flown across the room and shattered whatever fragile bond we still had, the phone rang early in the morning. The sound startled me because it was a landline, not the cell phone I usually kept in my pocket. Something about the old ring filled the house with urgency, the way it used to when bad news travelled faster than people could prepare for it. I picked up, and the voice on the other end was not Rebecca's, but a flat male tone, identifying itself as an officer from the county jail. He said my daughter had been arrested the night before. My knees nearly buckled at those words, and I gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. The officer explained in a practiced voice that Rebecca had been involved in an altercation at a bar downtown. There had been drinking, loud arguments, and at some point she had struck another woman with a glass. There was talk of theft, of unpaid tabs, of resisting when the police arrived. The words blurred together, but the meaning was clear. My daughter was in serious trouble, and she was sitting in a cell waiting for someone to claim her. I asked how badly the other woman had been hurt, and the officer said she had been taken to the hospital for stitches but would recover. He spoke like it was all routine, but for me, it was as if the ground had opened under my feet. Then he said Rebecca had asked them to call me. The moment I heard that, my breath caught. Of all the people she could have reached out to, after screaming that I had stolen her life, she still wanted me to come. I agreed to drive down, though my hands shook as I wrote down the details. My grandson, overhearing enough to understand, began to cry silently at the table, his spoon clinking against his cereal bowl. He whispered, "Is Mom okay?" And I pulled him into my arms, promising I would try to bring her home, though my own heart doubted whether that was even possible. The drive to the jail felt endless. I kept gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Memories flashed. Rebecca, as a toddler in the back seat, singing along to the radio, her tiny voice filling the car with joy. Rebecca on her first day of high school, too nervous to speak, and me telling her she could conquer anything if she just kept her head high. Now I was heading to see her in chains, or at least behind glass, and I could not reconcile those images with the reality. When I arrived, the officer at the front desk treated me with the same detached courtesy he probably used for everyone. He slid a form toward me and explained the procedures in a voice stripped of emotion. I sat on the plastic chair, pen shaking in my hand, filling out the paperwork, trying to steady my breathing. The walls smelled of bleach and despair, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as though mocking my fragile composure. Finally, they called me into a small visiting room with scratched tables and thick glass partitions. When she walked in, my daughter looked nothing like the fiery woman who had screamed at me days earlier. Her hair was messy, her eyes swollen from crying, and her body slumped as though every ounce of defiance had drained away. She picked up the phone on her side of the glass and pressed it to her ear, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Then her voice broke. "Mama, please, get me out of here." The sound of her begging nearly broke me. It was the same mouth that had hurled accusations, the same voice that had accused me of stealing her life, now trembling and soft, calling for the woman she had just condemned. I wanted to wrap her in my arms, to pretend she was still that child who looked to me for safety. But I also wanted to shake her, to ask her how she could stand there and demand more from me after all the damage she had done. She explained in a rush that bail had been set, that she needed money to pay it, that she couldn't survive in that cell. Her words were desperate, tumbling over each other, and she promised she would change, that she would get help, that she would do better if I just gave her this one last chance. I listened. My heart split in two. On one side was the mother who had spent decades sacrificing everything for her, who wanted to protect her from every cruelty. On the other side was the woman who had finally begun to realize that each sacrifice only fed an endless hunger, that saving her again might mean losing myself forever. The officer, watching from the corner, signaled that time was almost up, and I pressed my hand to the glass, aching with the need to touch her, to feel some trace of the daughter I remembered. She pressed her hand back, eyes pleading, lips trembling. "Please, Mama, don't leave me here." When I walked out of that jail, the sun felt too bright, the air too sharp, and the world too loud. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, unable to start the engine. The words she had screamed at me, "You stole my life," collided with the words she had just begged, "Get me out of here." Between those two sentences was the truth I could no longer escape. My daughter saw me not as a mother, not as a guide, not even as a woman with her own life, but as her safety net, her rescuer, her endless resource. And I had to decide whether I would continue to play that role or finally step away, even if it broke my heart in half. I drove home from the jail with my hands locked at 10 and 2, the muscles in my forearms rigid and sore, as if holding the steering wheel too loosely would let my whole life skid off the road. And while the traffic crawled and the radio murmured, meaningless morning chatter, I kept replaying Rebecca's face on the other side of the glass, the way her mouth trembled when she said, "Mama, please." The way her hand flattened against the window as if there were only that pain and my reluctance, standing between her and freedom. And I told myself that before I made any decision, I needed facts. not just the ache of a mother's heart. So instead of going home, I pulled into the county building where intake records were kept. A squat brick box, smelling of old paper and floor wax. And I asked the clerk, in a voice that tried to be steady, what exactly my daughter had done. Not because I wanted to hear her sins recited like a litany, but because truth is the only thing stronger than the guilt that has governed my choices since the day she was born. The clerk, a tired woman with sympathetic eyes and the kind of patience that must be worn thinner by noon, tapped at her keyboard, squinted at the screen, and told me in a careful tone that Rebecca had been arrested for assault, public intoxication, resisting a peace officer, and theft of services, which meant the bar claimed she drank. She argued. She broke a glass across a woman's cheek, and then tried to leave without paying, and as if the charges themselves were not enough to collapse a mother's lungs. The clerk added that she was already on probation for a prior misdemeanor, a fight last spring behind a club I didn't know she frequented, and that set the judge's mood for bail at a higher figure than ordinary, which might have been avoidable if she had a clean record, but she did not. And with that, the narrative I had clung to, that my child had simply had one reckless night, began to crumble in the fluorescent light. I asked whether there was any mention of other incidents, hoping the answer would be no, that this was a singular rock in a smooth field. But the clerk, who looked like she wished she could tell me something softer, said the system showed multiple police contacts without arrests, noise complaints, disturbances at apartments, a welfare check when a neighbour reported shouting. And while she did not say the words that hovered between us, I heard them anyway. Your daughter has been unravelling for a while, and you were the last to admit it. I took the thin packet the clerk printed, a sterile list of charges, dates, codes, and a court time circled in blue ink, and I sat on a bench in the hallway and stared at it until the letters blurred. And I thought about how many times I had chosen to explain away small signs, how often I had mistaken pride for strength and silence for peace, how even last month, when the landlord slipped a notice under my door, addressed not to me, but to Rebecca, warning about late rent on the apartment she swore she could manage without my help. I told myself that a grown woman was allowed to stumble, that my stepping back was necessary if she was ever going to stand tall, and yet somehow my stepping back had turned into my sleeping with one eye open, waiting for a crisis to bang on the front door, which is exactly what the phone call from the jail had been. I called my sister from that bench, and she said in a low voice that if I paid the bail without conditions, we would be standing in that same hallway again before the month was out, because we had both seen how Rebecca changed her promises, like outfits, all sincerity in the morning and something else by night. And I knew my sister was right, because love without boundaries is a leash that drags you behind someone else's chaos until you no longer recognize your own footsteps. I folded the packet and slid it into my purse next to my checkbook, a placement that felt symbolic and dangerous. And I told myself that if I was going to help at all, I needed to know where the money would go, what legal path existed beyond the revolving door of bail and apology, and whether there was any room in this system for a mother who wanted to save her child without killing herself in the process. The public defender's office was 2 floors up, crowded with plastic chairs, scuffed baseboards, and a bulletin board cluttered with flyers for treatment programs, housing leads, and free clinics. And as I waited for Rebecca's appointed counsel to finish another case, I watched people move in and out with folders clutched to their chests, their faces a mix of defiance and resignation that made me think of assembly lines where hope gets stamped into paperwork until the ink can't hold it anymore. When the attorney, a young black woman with braids pinned neatly behind her head and an expression that suggested she'd learned to be both fierce and diplomatic before law school, finally called my name, I followed her into a small office with a desk, piled in case files and a jar of peppermints that looked like they'd been there since winter. She introduced herself as Collier and asked if I was Rebecca's mother. And when I said yes, she sat, opened a fresh notepad, and said, in a voice both kind and direct, that she wanted to tell me what we were facing, because mothers deserve the truth. Even when it hurts, and there was no use pretending that a hug and a promise would fix what had been growing in the dark. She explained the charges and the range of penalties, noting that the assault would hinge on the victim's statement, that the theft of services could be negotiated if the bar was paid in full, and that resisting could sometimes be reduced if the body cam footage suggested confusion rather than malice. But she also pointed to the probation flag on a prior case and said, judges pay attention to patterns, not just bad nights, and that the bail number reflected not only risk of flight, but risk of repetition, which is another way of saying that a mother's history of rescuing can look like a forecast of future trouble in the eyes of the court. I asked about treatment, about the possibility that all this anger and drinking were symptoms of a wound she couldn't name, and Collier nodded, saying that the court ran a diversion docket tied to counselling and substance use programs, but it required commitment, regular attendance, and clean tests, and that too many defendants treated it like a revolving door because the work is heavy and slow, and patience is a currency most people in chaos haven't learned to earn. She asked whether I could help with bail, not as a demand, but as part of a strategy, because posting bond would bring Rebecca home and allow her to start an intake with a counsellor instead of meeting one in shackles, and it would also give Collier leverage to argue that Rebecca had support, that she was not alone in the void. But the attorney also said in a quiet tone that if I had posted bail before, if the money had come and gone, and the behaviour held steady, I needed to think hard about whether my help was a rope or a noose. I told her I had not posted bail before, that this was the first time jail had entered our vocabulary, and still I could feel in my bones that this was not the first time I had paid a price for Rebecca's storms, because there are many kinds of bail, and mothers post them daily. Rent money to keep the landlord quiet, car payments to keep a job alive, babysitting to cover the nights that stretch beyond reason, small lies told to employers when the truth threatens the last thin thread of respectability. Collier wrote down the bail figure, slid it toward me, and for a moment I saw not a number, but a pile of pills I would need when my knees finally demanded replacements. A new water heater the house would beg for this winter, groceries and co-pays, and the 1,000 quiet needs of a woman nearing 60 who had never asked much from anyone but had given more than most. I left the office with a list of phone numbers for treatment centres and a court date circled in red, and in the elevator I stared at my reflection in the brushed metal wall, and I barely recognised the woman looking back, her mouth set in a straight line like a stitched seam, her eyes rimmed with a grief that was old and new at once. And I thought how strange it is to be both the most reliable person in someone's life and the least respected, how love twists into duty and duty into resentment, until all the threads knot. On the ground floor, I almost walked straight out to my car and let inertia drive me to the bondsman. But something in me turned my steps down another hallway, toward a bulletin board on the public corridor labelled Victim Services and Family Resources, because even while my daughter was the one in the cell, I felt like a victim too, not of her alone, but of a system of expectations that told me to be endless, to be tireless, to be a well that never runs dry. A flyer caught my eye. A support group for parents of adult children in crisis held Thursday evenings at a church on the other side of town, and I slipped the paper into my purse as if it were contraband, because the idea that I might need a circle of strangers to say out loud what I could not say at my kitchen table felt both shameful and necessary. At home, the house was quiet, except for the washer thudding in its spin cycle, working hard to erase the last stains of last week's disaster. And on the counter sat a stack of envelopes that had arrived while I was gone, their windows shining with bureaucratic menace. I slit them open with a butter knife and felt my stomach sink as I unfolded notices I had not expected. A letter from a credit card company about a missed payment on an account I did not remember opening, a gentle but firm reminder from a medical office about an outstanding balance for services rendered to Rebecca, a cryptic postcard about a payday loan renewal, and a copy of an email printed by my sister, who knows I read paper better than screens, showing a transaction on a shared phone, plan we didn't share, listing my name as a guarantor. For a moment the room swayed, as if my house itself had tilted and all the objects within it were sliding into a pile labelled "You weren't paying attention." And then the angrier, steadier part of me rose and began sorting, stacking, calling, and when the hold music of the first creditor finally gave way to a human voice, I spoke the words I have spent a lifetime mastering in this country. My name is Angela. I am the account holder on my own life. Tell me exactly what is attached to me. Without my consent, by late afternoon, I had a rough map of the damage. At least one credit card opened online using my social security number and an old address where Rebecca used to receive mail. A payday loan rolled over twice with fees that bled like a slow leak under the kitchen sink. And a cell phone line that had been added months ago to an account in my name back when I co-signed to help her keep service after a job change. A kindness that had quietly become obligation. I pulled my old fireproof box from the hall closet, the one with family birth certificates and the deed to the house and a scattering of photographs that were supposed to remind me of why I never gave up. And I added a new folder, labeling it with a calm I did not feel. Evidence and actions. Because if I was going to climb out of this particular pit, I would need a ladder built from dates, statements, and a record of every call and promise and threat. I wrote down the bail number at the top of a page, and below it I made 2 columns, one titled, "Save Her Now, Pay Later," and the other, "Save Myself Now, Help Her Differently." And under each I listed consequences as if I were a scientist tracking outcomes, the way I used to chart patient vitals in graphite on clipboard sheets during the years before every chart glowed on a screen. As the sun dropped and the kitchen gained that dimness which makes dishes seem older and obligations heavier, the phone rang again, and this time it was a voice from Child and Family Services, a perfectly polite woman informing me that a report had been logged by the school counsellor who had noticed my grandson's anxiety and asked after his mother, which had led to the counsellor calling our house, which had led to my sister answering and explaining that Rebecca was in custody. And though the social worker assured me the call was routine, that they only wanted to ensure the child was safe and had a stable caregiver, I felt a cold ripple spread across my skin because it meant the circle was widening, that the consequences of Rebecca's actions were no longer locked behind concrete walls, but were reaching into the heart of our home. I answered every question as calmly as I could, gave the woman my sister's number, and promised that my grandson was with me, fed and clothed and loved. And after we hung up, I sat at the table and stared at the new folder labelled Evidence and Actions, and told myself that a mother's work has always included both tenderness and record-keeping, that the heart and the ledger are not enemies, but partners when life turns into a maze. That night, instead of pacing like I had for days, I drove to the address of the bar named in the incident report, a place I had never set foot in because my idea of a good evening involves a book, gospel on the radio, or a quiet talk with a friend. Over coffee, not neon signs and sticky floors. I parked half a block away and watched people come and go. And then I went inside, holding my chin high the way my own mother taught me to do when walking into rooms not built for our comfort. And I asked the man behind the bar if I could speak to the manager because I was the mother of a woman who had made a mess in his establishment, and I needed to understand how. And he looked at me with a complicated expression that included skepticism, kindness, and the bored fatigue of someone who has wiped up too many nights. The manager, a woman with forearms like tree trunks and eyes that missed nothing, came out from the back and led me to a corner where the music didn't punch as hard. And when I explained who I was and what I wanted, she sighed and said she didn't make a habit of revisiting the roughest moments of a weekend, but she could tell me that my daughter had not been alone, that she'd arrived with a man who had escalated every small thing into a spark and then a flame, that the argument had begun with jealousy and moved to money, that the other woman had called Rebecca a name, and Rebecca had responded with a glass because pain travels faster than reason when liquor greases the road. I asked about cameras, and she nodded, said there was footage the police already had, and in her telling, I saw not an excuse, but a pattern. My daughter was not only falling apart by herself, she was choosing people who handed her the tools to destroy what was left. On the drive home, I passed the storefront of a pawn shop where, months earlier, I had recognized the shape of my old mixer in the window, a sentimental appliance my mother had given me when I bought the house, and had told myself I must be mistaken. Because who would take such a thing? And now it seemed foolish that I had not walked in then and asked, because tonight I did. And the clerk, a thin man with a habit of wiping the same clean counter as if erasing his own fingerprints, told me he remembered a young woman bringing in pieces that looked like heirlooms but priced like junk. And while he couldn't share names, he could say with a shrug that hard times make people trade their histories for cash every day. And who was he to judge? I left without arguing, because my fight was not with him. And when I reached my car, I rested my forehead on the steering wheel and let the sobs come. Not because of the mixer itself, but because it was proof that something had been slipping through, the cracks in my attention while I was busy muting my own alarms. At home, I found my grandson asleep on the couch, a cartoon still flickering silently on the screen, and I turned off the television, covered him with a blanket, and sat beside him, tracing the curl at his temple that looked exactly like his mother's when she was 5, and I wondered how many more nights he would have to pretend not to hear adult words that stain a child's heart. I opened my new folder and added notes about the bar. The boyfriend I would ask my sister to identify from the photos on Rebecca's social media if I could bring myself to look. The pawn shop, the creditors, the call from family services, the conversation with Collier, and under all of it I wrote a sentence that hurt to ink but felt like the only guide I could trust. If I post this bail, it will be with a plan that values my survival as much as her freedom, with conditions that protect the child in this house, with the understanding that love does not mean funding destruction. The night stretched, and I could feel the first escalation in my bones, not merely in the court's paperwork or the thicker case file, but in the way I was being forced to grow a new spine and a new voice, ones that could hold love and boundaries in the same breath. The next morning, before the courthouse opened, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going lukewarm and drafted a list of non-negotiables in my head. If I paid the bail, Rebecca would come to my house only if she agreed to treatment intake. Within 24 hours, to 3 meetings a week for 90 days, to a budget that I would not bankroll except for necessities that protected the child, to no contact with the man whose name I had written on a sticky note after calling my sister. to the understanding that any violence, any rage, any broken promise would end with me calling Collier, calling the bondsman, and letting the system carry what I could not. I hated every word because they made me feel like a warden when what I wanted was my daughter back. But the truth settled like a stone. I did not want prison for her, yet I could not trade my last years for a cycle that had no horizon. I tucked the list into the folder, placed it by the door with my purse and keys, and when the sun came up, I felt not lighter, but steadier, which is not the same as hope, but sometimes it is the first necessary step toward it. By the time the court date arrived, I felt like the days had merged into one long and sleepless night. My hours divided between work, caring for my grandson, fielding calls from creditors, and staring at the folder I had built like a soldier, assembling armor before battle. Yet nothing in me felt armored when I walked into that courthouse, its grey walls rising like a fortress built to remind people like me of our smallness. And even though I had pressed my best coat, the one I kept for funerals and church anniversaries, I could feel the weight of eyes on me, as if everyone knew I was carrying both my daughter's future and my own fragile dignity in a single worn handbag. Rebecca shuffled into the courtroom in chains, her eyes darting nervously, her hair tied back without care. And for a second, I saw not the 34-year-old woman who had accused me of stealing her life, but the 10-year-old who once begged me to press her hair before picture day, nervous about looking too different from the white girls in her class. And my chest clenched with that old ache of protection that has never left me no matter how badly she wounds me. The judge entered, an older white man with spectacles low on his nose and the aura of someone used to having the final word. And when the bailiff called our case, I felt my pulse in my throat, beating so hard I wondered if the sound filled the room. The prosecutor read charges with the crispness of someone ordering from a menu they had memorized. Assault, resisting arrest, theft of services, probation violation, each syllable landing like a hammer. And then Collier, the young public defender, rose, and in a voice both firm and respectful, painted Rebecca not as a menace, but as a struggling woman in need of treatment, of guidance, of one more chance. And for the first time in years, I heard someone besides me speak of my daughter with a tone that contained hope. The victim, a woman with a stitched cheek and eyes that would not look at us, gave her statement, saying Rebecca had been wild, that she had felt fear, that she wanted accountability. And I could not hate her for that, because if the roles were reversed, I might have said worse, but each word carved deeper into the image of the girl I raised. When the judge leaned back and steepled his fingers, considering whether Rebecca would remain behind bars until trial or be granted release under bond, I felt the whole room hold its breath. And then his voice came, deliberate and heavy. Bail 2. Remain as set. Release permitted upon payment, with the condition of immediate intake into a treatment program. Failure to comply resulting in revocation. The gavel struck, and though the room buzzed again with whispers and movement, I sat frozen, because in that instant I understood the weight of the midpoint I had reached. Either I gave up my last savings, the cushion between me and poverty, or I left my daughter to languish in a cell where she might finally learn the consequence of her actions, but might also break beyond repair. My sister squeezed my hand, her silent way of reminding me that survival sometimes requires saying no. But my eyes had already drifted to Rebecca's face as deputies guided her out, her lips mouthing one word over and over, "Please?" And I knew my war was no longer just against her chaos, but against my own inability to let go. That night, I laid out every bill, every statement, every notice on the dining table until the surface vanished under paper. and I forced myself to calculate in black ink the reality I had avoided. If I paid the bail, my savings account would fall. Below the line I swore I would never cross, the line that separated stability from dependence on charity. And yet, if I did not pay, I would carry the knowledge that I had left my child in jail when I could have opened the door. I thought of the church women who told me tough love was still love, of the social workers' polite questions about my grandson's care, of my late mother's voice reminding me that every generation of black women in our family had carried burdens heavier than they could afford, and I wondered if I was continuing a legacy of sacrifice or finally betraying it. My grandson tiptoed into the room, his small hand reaching for mine, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grandma, is Mum coming home?" And I had to bite down hard on the inside of my cheek to keep from sobbing, because children do not understand bail, amounts or probation violations. They only understand absence. I pulled him close, inhaling the scent of sleep and crayons on his skin, and I promised him I would keep him safe, though in my heart I knew safety for him might mean risk for me. The next day I went to the bondsman's office, a narrow space with faded carpet and a wall of security cameras looping images of people just like me, people caught between love and survival, and the man behind the glass spoke numbers and percentages with the indifference of someone selling bus tickets. And when he slid the paperwork toward me, I felt as though I were signing not just for Rebecca's release, but for the mortgage of my own body and spirit. I signed anyway, my hand steady despite the tremor in my heart. And when I stepped outside with the receipt in my purse, the air felt thin, the sky too wide, and I realized I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Hours later, when they released her, Rebecca walked toward me with her arms spread, as though she expected an embrace. But I did not move, and the confusion on her face when I simply handed her the folded paper with the address of the treatment center was sharper than any slap I could have delivered. "Straight there," I told her, my voice low and firm. "Or you go back inside." And for once, she did not argue, perhaps because the chains on her wrists had left marks that still burned. In the weeks that followed, the midpoint revealed itself not as a moment, but as a stretch of days balanced on a knife's edge. Rebecca attended sessions, but came home each evening brittle with resentment, muttering that the counselors didn't understand her, that the system was stacked against her, that everyone wanted to see her fail. I listened in silence, noting each excuse, each flare of anger, writing them down in the folder that had become my anchor. Because if this story ended in court again, I would not stand unprepared. My grandson began to sleep more peacefully, but sometimes I caught him staring at his mother with wary eyes, as though he no longer knew whether she was the same woman who once sang him to sleep. And that small, cautious gaze pierced me deeper than any creditor's letter. One evening, while Rebecca stormed in her room, I stood at the sink washing dishes, and I felt the slow burn of realization. This was the middle of the battle, not the end, and my role was shifting from rescuer to witness, from enabler to record. Keeper. And perhaps that was the only way to survive loving someone who did not know how to love herself. The week began with the kind of fragile hope that makes you afraid to breathe too deeply, because Rebecca had strung together several days of showing up to her program and coming home tired instead of furious. And my grandson had started drawing pictures of the three of us at the kitchen table with a sun in the corner, which I took as a sign his little heart believed in ordinary evenings again. And I found myself scrubbing the stove with more care than necessary, as if a clean surface could hold the peace in place. But hope in this house has always been a skittish animal. And by Thursday afternoon, the phone calls started tripping over one another like people trying to crowd through a single door. First, the treatment center asking if I knew why Rebecca had missed her group the night before, and seemed to have disappeared from their radar since lunchtime, their tone professional but unmistakably weary. Then the bondsman leaving a clipped message about a potential violation and a reminder that if conditions were broken, the court could revoke release at any moment. And before I could finish writing down the names and numbers in my folder, the bank's fraud department reached me to confirm an online attempt to move cash from my savings into a new account using a device they did not recognize, and even though they held the transfer, the agent's question, had I authorized anyone to access my account remotely, made my mouth go dry because I could hear Rebecca in the next room, humming to music and rifling through drawers that did not belong to her. And I suddenly realized how thin the wall was between our lives and collapse. I walked down the hall and found her sitting cross-legged on the floor with my checkbook open and my folder on her lap. The folder I had built from every phone call and receipt and promise like a bridge between me and chaos. And she looked up with a smile that did not reach her eyes and said she was helping, that she was going to handle some bills for me because she felt bad about all the trouble she had caused. And I told her to put everything back, my voice careful and even because I have learned that when you pour gasoline on a scene with a spark in it, you invite a fire. And she tilted her head in that way she does when she's about to twist the air, asking if I thought she was a thief, asking if I really believed she would steal from her own mother after her mother had stolen her youth. And there it was again, that phrase slung like a chain, and I felt the ground tilt as if I were the one who had to apologize for defending the last corners of my life. I took the folder from her hands and placed it on the top shelf of the pantry where I keep the good china and the cereal boxes, not because it was a logical place, but because I needed it out of her reach in the seconds before I could think clearly, and I locked the checkbook in the old metal box where I keep birth certificates, and I told her that missing a group put everything at risk, that the court could yank her back inside, that the bondsman had already called, that we were one mistake away from forfeiting the money I did not have to spare. And she laughed, an ugly, hollow sound, and said I loved money more than I loved her, that a black mother who had sacrificed should know better than to become the white man's little accountant, keeping ledgers while her child drowned. And I stood there remembering every hospital shift where I learned to count pills because someone else was counting on me to live. And I wanted to tell her there is no freedom without numbers adding up. But I swallowed the lecture because her pupils were wide and her palms were restless, and I could feel the storm coming. The knock at the door landed like a gavel, not a courtesy rap, but the insistent pounding of someone who already believed they had a right to enter. And when I opened it, 2 officers stood on the porch with the cautious posture of men who expected resistance. One of them the same young man who had watched me sign papers at the jail. The other older with a mustache and tired shoulders. And behind them my sister hovered on the sidewalk with worry written plain across her face. And before I could sort the strands of dread in my chest, the older officer explained that they were there on a welfare check initiated by a report claiming an elderly resident was being financially controlled and emotionally abused by a family member, and that they needed to speak with me and with Rebecca separately to ensure no one was under duress. And for a moment, the hallway swam because the accusation flipped everything upside down, painting me as the abuser and Rebecca as the one needing rescue. And I understood at once that the knife was not just at my savings, but at my name. Rebecca slipped past me into the frame and started to cry with a skill that made me ache, telling them I had taken her ID, that I had locked up her money, that I had threatened to send her back to jail if she didn't do what I wanted. And even though I knew the program required her to turn in substances, not driver's licenses, and the bond conditions required structure, not captivity, I could see in the officers' eyes that they had heard versions of this story before, and that their job was to treat the possibility seriously until it was dispelled by facts, which meant my folder, my call logs, my copy of the bond paperwork, my notes with times and names, and the calendar of her groups were no longer private armor, but the only shield I had left. I showed them everything, with hands that would not stop shaking. And when the younger officer recognized Collier's name on the documents, he softened slightly, calling the public defender to verify the conditions and reporting the missed group, and, while he made those calls, the older one asked if there were any weapons in the house, if there was a safe place for the child, if I had felt threatened. And I heard myself saying that love can be as dangerous as a weapon when it turns a person into a tool, that I did not fear my daughter hurting me in the way people mean when they speak of knives and fists, but I feared the erosion that comes from living alongside someone who treats your kindness like a well that never runs dry. And even as the words left my mouth, I sensed how fragile they sounded compared to a bruised cheek or a broken lock. The younger officer returned with confirmation that the program had flagged Rebecca, that the bond office was preparing a notice, and when he said those words, she exploded, cursing the system, cursing me, promising that if she went back inside it, would be my fault, that I had engineered this to punish her, that I had always envied her beauty and youth, and wanted her dependent so I could feel powerful. And hearing that was like swallowing glass, because I had spent a lifetime making myself small so she could take up space. They did not arrest her, because that was not their purpose that afternoon. But they left with stern warnings and a recommendation to return to the center immediately. And as their cruiser pulled away, my sister stepped into the doorway and gathered my grandson into her arms, whispering that he would come to her house for the night so I could think without little ears in the room. And while she packed his pajamas and favorite book, Rebecca stormed into the kitchen, yanked open the pantry, and grabbed the folder from the top shelf with a triumphant cry I hadn't expected, because I had forgotten I had moved it there. And before I could reach her, she tore at the papers with a fury that felt less like anger and more like fear, shredding copies of statements, scattering business cards, crumpling the timeline I had built. And as the pages fell like tired birds to the floor, she shouted that I would not weaponize her mistakes against her, that if I loved her, I would let the past go, that only enemies kept records. I stood in the ruin of my careful notes and felt something inside me break in a new way. Not the crack of sorrow, but the muffled thud of a boundary slamming shut, because I understood at last that fairness would never be part of this equation, that the system would demand receipts from me while taking none from her, that the money I had risked and the stability I had bled for could be erased in an afternoon by a handful of lies and a tantrum. And it was in that moment, papers underfoot, officers' tail lights disappearing, my grandson's small backpack zipping closed, that the story took its unjust turn, and the midpoint's delicate balance gave way to a tilt I could not correct by will alone. That night, after my sister drove away with the child, and the house settled into a brittle quiet we had not known since before the arrest, Rebecca slipped out with the same careless hurry she brought into every room, clutching her purse and a jacket that was not hers, leaving a line of footprints on the walkway that the evening dew quickly blurred. And when I checked the drawer where I kept the spare keys, I saw the empty space where the set had been. And I knew she was not going to the program. She was not going to the church meeting. She was not going anywhere that would hold her to the promises she had made in court. My phone buzzed with a text from the bondsman asking me to confirm Rebecca's whereabouts for a compliance visit. And as I stared at the screen, I felt the walls press in, because if she failed to appear the next morning, the court could revoke her, Release and the bond company would not come collecting compassion. They would come collecting money, and if money could not be produced, they would collect stability in its place. And I would stand once again in a hallway with forms in my hands, begging for a different outcome from the same script. I sat at the table with the remnants of my ruined folder and gathered what was salvageable, smoothing bent corners, retyping dates from memory, calling the program to leave a message that she was on her way, even as I knew she was not. And in that heavy, unfair hour, it became clear that the next time I spoke in a courtroom, I would not be able to stand in the old posture of the endlessly forgiving mother, because forgiveness without accountability had become the currency that kept paying for everyone else's comfort with my life. The days that followed were not measured in hours, but in alarms, in phone calls, in the sound of footsteps pacing the hallway as I tried to decide if I was hearing my daughter return or my own fear echoing back at me. When Rebecca finally came through the door 3 mornings later, she was not apologetic or contrite, but hollow-eyed, her skin sallow, her hands jittery, as if electricity pulsed through her veins. And before I could even ask where she had been, she announced that she had a plan, that she was going to fix everything if only I would stop standing in her way. She spoke of jobs she would land, of debts she would erase, of people she could charm into helping her, and it was the confidence of someone rehearsing lies so often they began to sound like gospel. And for the first time I did not respond with encouragement, but with silence, which she treated like a personal insult. She stormed out again, slamming the door so hard the picture of my late parents shifted on the wall, and I sat staring at their frozen smiles, wondering if they would have told me to endure or to cut my losses. That evening, I went to the mailbox and found a letter from the bail company, stamped urgent, reminding me that failure to keep Rebecca in compliance would result in forfeiture of bond and immediate action against the signer. My name glared from the page in thick ink, a name I had once carried with pride, but which now felt like a trapdoor swinging beneath my feet. I placed it in the folder that was now patched together with tape after Rebecca's last fury, and I wondered if the court would care about the missing pages, or if they would only see a black mother who had gambled her limited resources on a daughter the system already assumed was beyond redemption. The injustice of that thought pressed against my ribs like a fist. The second escalation came in the form of whispers, not shouts. A neighbour, Mrs. Klein, who had always waved politely but never lingered, stopped me at the grocery store to ask if everything was all right at my house. She said she had heard loud arguments, the sound of something breaking, a young woman's voice cursing at all hours. I felt the heat rise in my face because humiliation in public is a different animal than the private shame of family betrayal. I told her I was managing, that my daughter was going through a rough patch, but her eyes lingered on me too long, and I knew the gossip had already spread beyond my control. In small towns, a woman's struggle becomes everyone's pastime, and it does not take long before sympathy turns to suspicion. The next morning, Child Protective Services came to the door. The woman who introduced herself spoke in a voice too soft for the sharpness of her purpose. She said they had received an anonymous call suggesting that my grandson was living in an unsafe environment, that there were concerns about violence, about neglect, about financial instability. I nearly collapsed right there, because I understood instantly that the anonymous call had not come from a stranger, but from my own daughter, weaponizing the very love I had used to shield her. I led the worker through the house, showed the neatly folded clothes, the stocked pantry, the homework lined up on the table, the drawings on the refrigerator. She nodded and took notes, but I could feel the weight of her gaze, the way she catalogued not only the evidence of care, but the cracks in the story, the stress in my voice, the faint smell of cigarette smoke on Rebecca's discarded jacket. She left saying she would file a report, and I knew that meant more visits, more scrutiny, more nights lying awake fearing the knock that would take my grandson away from me. Rebecca returned later that night, stumbling, her face lit with a manic brightness that had nothing to do with joy. She laughed when I confronted her, laughed like I had told the funniest joke in the world, and said I was paranoid, that the state was always sniffing around families like ours because they could not stand to see us rise. But when I pressed her, when I asked if she had made the call, she turned her back, her shoulders stiff, and muttered that sometimes mothers needed to be taught lessons. That phrase lodged in my chest like a shard of glass. She was no longer just flailing in her own chaos. She was now willing to drag me down deliberately, to burn the house around both of us if it meant proving she had power. I began to keep a separate journal hidden in the lining of my handbag, writing down times, dates, exact words spoken. It was the only way I could feel sane, because gaslighting thrives in silence, and I refused to let my memory be rewritten by her shifting stories. Still, every new entry felt like both salvation and indictment, because each page proved that the daughter I had once rocked to sleep now saw me as an obstacle rather than an anchor. The second escalation revealed itself fully one Friday night when the police lights painted our walls red and blue. Rebecca had taken the car without permission, driven it into a ditch 2 towns over, and when the officers brought her back, she was shouting my name, demanding I explain to them that everything was a misunderstanding. The neighbours gathered at their windows, peering through blinds, their silhouettes outlined by the flashing lights, and I felt stripped bare before them. My private nightmare turned into public theatre. The officers asked if I wanted to press charges for the stolen car, and though my mouth formed the word no, my heart screamed yes, because I understood that mercy had become another form of bondage. When they left, Rebecca collapsed on the couch, sobbing, not from remorse but from the humiliation of being seen. She clutched my arm with desperate fingers and swore she would change, that she would enter the program in earnest this time, that she would rebuild trust. I sat rigid, her grip cutting off the blood flow to my hand, and I realized that promises had become her currency, and I was bankrupt from believing them. Over the following days, the tension in the house grew unbearable. My grandson clung to me, asking when things would go back to normal, and I had no answer because normal had been dismantled piece by piece until there was only survival. Bills piled up. My savings account hovered near zero, and still Rebecca demanded, still Rebecca accused, still Rebecca threatened. One evening she screamed so loudly the glass in the cabinet rattled, accusing me of conspiring with the courts, with the bondsman, with the entire world to keep her down. And in that moment I realized the escalation was no longer about her mistakes, but about the destruction of everything tethering me to dignity. I called my sister, my voice shaking, and told her I was afraid. She came the next morning with bags packed, insisting I send Rebecca away, insisting I reclaim the house before it collapsed entirely. But when we confronted Rebecca, she stood in the doorway with eyes blazing and declared that she would rather see us all homeless than admit she needed help. And I saw in her the reflection of every generational wound we had tried to bury. Poverty, racism, betrayal, addiction, all concentrated into a single furious woman daring me to stop her. And so the second escalation was not a moment, but a siege, a tightening of the noose, a slow suffocation of safety. It was the state watching me, the neighbours whispering about me, the law threatening to drain me, and my own daughter weaponizing motherhood against me. I stood in the wreckage of a home that still looked neat on the surface, but throbbed with chaos underneath. And I knew that the next turn would either destroy me or force me to expose everything in the brightest light possible, because there was no longer any middle ground left to stand on. The day of the hearing arrived with a sky the colour of old steel and a wind that pushed against my coat, as if it were testing whether I would hold. And I walked up the courthouse steps, carrying a rebuilt folder, thicker than the one Rebecca had torn, its edges square, its tabs labelled in my neat hand, its weight reminding me with each step that I had chosen to become the historian of my own life instead of the casualty of hers. My sister met me in the hallway, kissed my cheek, and pressed a small cross into my palm. Not for show, but for strength. And when the bail bondsman nodded at me from a bench across the corridor, I realized how many unlikely allies a woman collects when she stops apologizing for her needs. Collier emerged from a conference room with her legal pad, steady as ever, and told me in a voice that made me feel seen that today would be difficult, because the court had folded several concerns into one calendar: the bond compliance review, the probation violation, and a family court status check triggered by the Child Protective Services visit, which meant that everything private was about to be dragged under the bright courthouse lights, where people whisper while pretending not to watch. I breathed slowly, held the cross until my palm warmed it, and told myself that this was what a climax felt like. Not the peak of a mountain, but the edge of a cliff where you decide whether to jump or to build a bridge in mid-air. Rebecca was escorted into the courtroom, not in chains this time, but with a deputy close enough to remind everyone that her freedom was conditional. And when she turned and found me, confusion flickered across her face because I did not rise or open. My arms or mouth a promise that I would fix it. I sat still, my hands over my folder, my eyes level, and for the first time in months I felt like a woman and not a resource. The judge, a different one from the first hearing, a black woman whose gaze could have sliced marble, called the case, and the prosecutor laid out the missed program sessions, the welfare check, the report from officers who had retrieved my car from the ditch, and the bondsman confirmed the compliance contacts that had gone unanswered. Collier rose, careful and precise, and argued that there had been progress despite backsliding, that a recent intake note recorded genuine effort, that relapse was common on the path to recovery, and that incarceration would cut off the slender lines. Still mooring Rebecca to hope, the judge listened without blinking, then looked at me and said she would hear from the person holding the centre of this storm. It was neither a request nor an invitation. It was a decision that this day would not end with my silence. I stood, walked to the small wooden podium, and placed the folder beside the microphone as if I were placing a hand on a Bible. And when I began to speak, my voice did not shake, because I had rehearsed the truth in empty rooms and in my sleep and in the mirror until it fit my mouth. I told the court that I had posted the bond with money I could not afford to lose, because I believed in my daughter's capacity to right herself if there were a structure around her strong enough to lean on. And I told them that since that day I had kept records of every effort and every failure, not to shame her, but to protect what remained of our lives and to insulate a child from harm. I narrated the missed meetings, the officer's visit, the shredded papers, the attempt on my account, the car in the ditch, the night the walls turned red and blue while neighbours peered through their blinds at my unravelling. And I did it without drama, because facts, when lined up properly, carry more thunder than any plea. The prosecutor asked questions meant to poke holes in my account, wanting to know whether I had ever withheld money to control Rebecca, and I answered that I had withheld nothing except participation in my own destruction, that I had offered rides, phone numbers, childcare, grocery lists, calendars, and that the only thing I refused to fund anymore was chaos. Collier stepped in gently and asked whether I could name what I needed from the court, whether I had an ask, and the word itself felt unfamiliar, because mothers are taught to request nothing, to stretch until the seams give way. But I understood that a climax is not simply a confession, It is a choice. I said I needed my grandson's safety formalized, not left floating on the kindness of a system that might change its mind at the next phone call. I said I needed the program to be a mandate backed by teeth rather than a suggestion my daughter could treat like weather. I said that if jail was the only boundary Rebecca would respect, then I would not stand in the way of it. But if the court believed a stringent, verified outpatient plan could hold, then I would provide transportation, hot meals, and a bed that did not enable using, as long as the house rules were no longer negotiable. The judge watched me as if weighing each sentence in her palm, and in her stillness I felt a kind of care rarer than pity. Then Rebecca's turn came, and she approached the podium with that volatile mix of tears and defiance that has spoken for her since she learned that crying buys time and anger buys distance. She said I had humiliated her, that I had turned her life into exhibits in a case mounted against her, that I had always preferred control to love and respectability to freedom. And when she choked on the phrase, "You stole my life," a murmur shifted through the room because it hung there like a weapon she had sharpened for months. I did not flinch, though it cut the same way it had the first night, because repetition dulls the blade for the listener, even if the speaker feels it anew. The judge asked her why she had missed the program sessions if she believed recovery was her path forward, and Rebecca said transportation, said bad counselors, said a hostile environment, but her answers slid across the wood like oil, and in the space that followed, quiet roared. From the back row, my neighbour, Mrs. Klein, stood when the judge invited community comment, and in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness, she said she had seen the police lights, had heard the shouting, had also seen my grandson leave for school each morning with his shirt tucked and his homework in a folder, that she had knocked on my door with a casserole the week after the arrest and found a clean house and a trembling grandmother. And while she did not want to disparage my daughter, she believed the child's stability sat behind my door, not behind my daughter's promises. The CPS worker, called forward and sworn, confirmed that her walkthrough had revealed no hazards in my care, and that her recommendation was temporary guardianship with me until the case stabilized. The bondsman, who never expected to speak, cleared his throat and said that in his experience, people showed you who they were at the compliance window, and that I had shown up for Rebecca even when Rebecca did not show up for herself, and that if the court wanted its bond honored, it might consider placing a different person in charge of Rebecca's calendar than Rebecca. The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled, and said that this was the moment the law fuses with lived life, that statutes are blunt tools and families are delicate machines, and that she could not, in good conscience, allow a child to drift in. Uncertainty, or a mother's limited resources to be ground into dust. She ordered temporary legal guardianship of my grandson to me, with monitored visits for Rebecca, contingent on clean tests and session attendance verified by the court. She converted the outpatient program to a stricter schedule with random checks and a curfew enforced by electronic monitoring, and she warned that a single violation would trigger either inpatient treatment or remand. The gavel's report ricocheted like a thunderclap, and with it came a lift in my chest that was not joy, but breath returning to a body that had forgotten how to inhale without calculating who needed oxygen first. Rebecca spun toward me with eyes bright, not with gratitude but with fury, hissing that I had orchestrated this, that I had paraded her weakness for strangers, that I wanted custody of her son just to parade my goodness at church. And I met her gaze, without blinking, because in that instant the climax demanded one more act. I stepped to the side of the podium and spoke not to the bench, but to my daughter, telling her that I had not stolen her life, I had survived mine, and offered her shelter inside it, and that today I had chosen to protect a child and a future instead of an excuse, and that if she wanted to stand beside me in that future, she could, but the price would be honesty, sweat, and a surrender she had never practiced. My words did not soften her. Rage rarely dissolves in a single hearing, but they drew a line through the center of the room that everyone could see. As deputies fitted the small black band around Rebecca's ankle, Collier touched my arm and whispered that I had done what most women only fantasize about doing. I had pulled my story into the open air and refused to let anyone else narrate it. I nodded, because the truth felt like solid ground underfoot for the first time in a long while. Outside, the wind had calmed, and my sister wrapped her arm around my shoulders as we watched my grandson run ahead to the car, his backpack thumping against his small spine, his laughter breaking free like water finding a channel after a flood. Recedes. I did not pretend that the fight was over. Climaxes rarely settle anything neatly, but I understood with a clarity that steadied my steps that the center had shifted at last, that love without boundaries had been replaced with love that could hold, and that the next time Rebecca shouted that I had stolen her life, I would answer. Not with explanations or money, but with the map of a path she was capable of walking only if she chose to move her own feet. When the house finally fell quiet, after weeks of hearings, arguments, visits from social workers, and the slow grind of official paperwork, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table one evening with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator for company, and for the first time in months I realized my body was not vibrating with dread. The folder that had traveled everywhere with me, bulging with notes, letters, compliance reports, and receipts, now sat neatly closed, its corners frayed from use, but no longer needed as armor in the same desperate way, because the judge's order had given me something I had been begging the universe for, a line of protection between my grandson's innocence and my daughter's storms. Rebecca now lived under the watch of a court-mandated program, her evenings restricted by curfews enforced with cold technology, and though my heart ached to see her bound by anything other than her own discipline, I also understood that survival sometimes requires scaffolding built out of steel. I did not dance with joy when guardianship papers arrived in the mail, granting me temporary custody of my grandson. Instead, I cried at the sink, dishwater splashing against my wrists, because the words on the page confirmed both loss and liberation. It meant my daughter was judged unfit for now, a truth sharper than any insult she had ever screamed at me. But it also meant that my grandson could lay his head down at night in a house where meals were steady and mornings predictable. The first week after the ruling, he began to hum again while doing his homework, the kind of idle child's tune that says a soul feels safe. Each note made me both proud and heartbroken, because music returned to him only after silence was imposed on his mother. The neighbors, who once whispered behind blinds, now stopped me on the sidewalk with casseroles and cautious words of solidarity. Some meant well, others were more curious than kind, but I accepted each gesture with the dignity of someone who had walked through fire and knew that any recognition of survival was a gift, even if offered imperfectly. The bondsman sent me a formal letter, thanking me for my cooperation, a rare courtesy in his line of work. And Collier, the young defender, called one evening just to say she admired my strength. I had never thought of myself as strong. Survival had always felt like compulsion rather than choice. But hearing it named out loud planted a seed inside me, something that might grow into a new way of seeing myself. Rebecca's calls came less frequently once the monitoring began, and when they did, they were clipped, a mixture of accusation and fragile longing. One evening, she demanded to know why I had betrayed her, why I had stood in court with papers that read like an indictment. I told her I had not betrayed her. I had told the truth. And if the truth felt like a betrayal, it was because she had built her life on illusions too thin to bear scrutiny. She hung up on me, and I sat staring at the silent phone, my chest heavy, my mind repeating the words I had never dared to say aloud before. I cannot save you if you do not choose to be saved. The line between love and rescue had finally revealed itself, and I knew that holding it was not cruelty, but the only chance for healing. For both of us. On Sundays, I returned to church after months away, sliding into the pew beside my sister, feeling the warmth of hymns rise around me like a balm. The pastor spoke of deserts and deliverance, of wandering before finding the promised land. And though I am not naive enough to believe court orders are miracles, I felt something close to gratitude bloom in me. I had walked through a desert of humiliation, had been accused of theft by my own blood, had been reduced to a witness in my own house. And yet here I sat, upright, breathing, with a child by my side who reached for my hand when the choir sang. That was deliverance enough for me. I began to take small steps for myself, acts of reclamation so modest they might look invisible to anyone else. Brewing tea in the good china cup instead of the chipped mug, ironing a dress I had not worn in years, taking my grandson to the library on Saturdays and letting him pick more books than I could carry, walking through the park without rushing home to check the door, daring to let the house be quiet without fearing the silence meant danger. Each step felt like stitching back together pieces of a woman I had not seen in decades. The woman who once laughed easily, who once believed her own story mattered beyond the roles of mother and grandmother. The hardest part of resolution was facing Rebecca, not in courtrooms, but in supervised visits, where she sat across from me with eyes clouded by resentment and shame, where her hands fidgeted as though the skin itself could not contain her restlessness. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she lashed out. Sometimes she sat mute. Each time I wanted to rush forward, to hold her, to remind her she was once the girl who pressed dandelions into my palm and called them bouquets. But I learned to sit still, to let silence do its work, because boundaries are not built with hugs alone. The social worker once whispered that love and accountability are the same coin, and I repeated that to myself like a scripture every time Rebecca's voice rose, every time my grandson looked to me for reassurance. The story did not end with redemption, not yet. My daughter was not transformed overnight into the woman she could be, but the resolution was never about her alone. It was about me choosing to survive with integrity, about me refusing to let her chaos erase the dignity I had built across decades of labor, sacrifice, and quiet endurance. The resolution was about a boy growing up in a home where laughter could return, where homework was done at the table without fear of shouting, where bedtime meant stories instead of slammed doors. It was about a black woman, 60 years old, who had been told all her life to bear more than her share, finally daring to say enough, to let the law and the light of truth stand beside her. When I look back now, I do not see only the food thrown in my face, or the cruel words screamed across a kitchen, though they are part of the fabric. I see the night I refused to back down in a courtroom where silence was expected, the moment I chose to protect a child, even at the cost of wounding a daughter, the hours I spent piecing together evidence as though I were both detective and defendant. I see survival shaped not as surrender, but as testimony, and I understand that the resolution is not a clean ending, but a foundation, a ground strong enough for my grandson to stand on, and, perhaps one day, strong enough for my daughter, if she ever decides to walk toward it. So I close the folder at last, tuck it away in the drawer, and light a candle at the kitchen table. The flame flickers steady, small but unyielding, much like me. Outside, the street is quiet, the neighbours' windows glowing softly, the world carrying on with its ordinary routines. Inside, my grandson curls up on the couch with his book, his laughter breaking out every few minutes, and I let the sound wash over me like a hymn. For the first time in a long time, peace does not feel like something distant or temporary. It feels like something I have claimed with both hands, something I intend to keep.